Today we're going to do a survey of all of Jewish history of 5,782 years in 40 minutes. So put on your seatbelts. This is a risky proposition. But before we tackle history, Jewish history in particular, I think it's important to emphasize how Jewish history is supposed to be understood very differently from general history. Number one, Jewish history will point to the hand of God. You cannot say that history just happens. There's a plan, and you could see the hand of God in history. Sometimes the hand of God is covered. You don't see it. You wait a few years, decades, centuries, and then you see how this is all part of a plan, on one hand. On the other hand, though it's all part of a plan, within that plan we have power to effect change in the world and to change the course of history. Ultimately, God's plan is going to be realized in the end. How you get from point A to point Z will depend a lot on our behavior and our actions. And when we look at all of Jewish history, we'll see there's a continuum. One period of history leads into another period of history. Another thing about Jewish history in particular, while many other nations of the world start off with major power, contributing tremendously to society, they end up fading away. Every single empire, without exception, has risen to the top and faded away. Jewish history is the opposite. We start off with very humble beginnings, and then we have like a meteor rising to the top. And that's probably one of the reasons why we're so misunderstood, because every other nation on earth, when they fall, and they don't come back, they don't bounce back. We bounce back after the Holocaust, to cite the most recent phenomenon. We have tremendous resiliency. Another thing, but a lot of Jews, proud Jews, miss a very important point. Everyone likes to talk about which group of people invented this. You know, the Russians claim that they invented everything. But we don't claim we invented everything. That's not important. Yes, we invented some things, I'm sure, but invention is not really what we're here for. On the contrary, what Judaism has done and contributed to history is restoring the good things that were lost and transforming the things that are not necessarily positive into something positive. Not innovation, but restoration and transformation. With that introduction, let's race through history. And the way I'm going to try to describe Jewish history is not the wars, the powers that came to the top and that fell, and those are the standard ways of looking at history. We're going to look at history through the eyes of the Torah. Number one, we start with creation. Yes, Jewish history begins with creation, even though the Jews didn't come on the scene for another 2,500 years, but creation is where it really began. When God created the world, as you heard me say so many times, he created it with a plan. When the first day of creation, God said, "Let there be light," that wasn't just the first creation, that was the way God was etched into stone. What is exactly my purpose in creation? I want the dark world to become light. I want you to illuminate the world. And that's why he created humans, because only human beings could create light. Because a human being is given the power to choose freely between right and wrong, and when he chooses right, he generates light. I'm not a poet, but it just happened to rhyme. When you do the right thing, you make the right choices, you bring the divine energy into this world. And when you bring enough of that divine energy into this world, the world becomes a transformed world. The world is no longer the same world as it was in the beginning. So God creates humans because if he just created animals, even spiritual animals, they're programmed beings. They can't make a difference. If they change, it's because God is making them change. Well, why did God have to create them to make them change? He could have changed the world in the very beginning. God created a world, an imperfect world, but with the ability to become perfect through the choices of sentient beings, beings that have the ability to choose freely between doing what God wants and rejecting it. So what does that God do? He creates a human being, one human being, Adam, split him into two. You have Adam and Eve, and he gave them a test. What was the test? Before I give you my master plan for the universe, I want to make sure that you're capable of passing the test. The first test was, don't eat the fruit of that forbidden tree. He failed the first test. So God says, okay, you're not going to be the beginning of the nation that I will entrust the master plan with. So then he waits 10 generations to make history go more quickly. We're not going to go through all the 10 generations. And here's a righteous man, Noah, who passes the first test admirably. He resists the temptation to be like everyone else. The world was a corrupt world, and he makes the world, he resists all the pressures of the whole world. And that's why God saves him and his family. So God says, I have a candidate already, someone who's going to become the father of a nation that will be given the master plan. What happens? He fails that second test. The second test is you have to be able to influence others. You can't just be someone who's righteous for yourself. You have to be able to change the hearts and minds of other people to make the world a better world. Noah did not have that capability. He was given free choice, of course, but he failed that second test. Noah did not change the hearts of even one person. It was a tough world. We're not going to put too much blame on him, but it was a tough world. So God waits another 10 generations, and now we're up to the year 1948. That's the year I was born. But I'm not that old. 1948, from creation of Adam. Abraham is born, and Abraham resists the pressures of the whole world. He fights idolatry, he introduces monotheism, and he spreads the word to the whole world. He is the one who brings the belief in one God to the whole world. And God says, now I have someone to work with, and I'm making a covenant with you that you and your children, your descendants, will become part of this nation to whom I will entrust the Torah. So what happens? Abraham has many sons. He has 8 sons. Only one of them follows in his footsteps, Isaac. Isaac has 2 sons. Only one, Jacob, follows in his footsteps. And now Jacob has 12 sons. And while they were basically people who followed in the teachings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they had a feud with their brother Joseph. And to make a long story short, they sell Joseph to Egypt. All this was part of a plan that God says, before I can give you the Torah, before I can give you the master plan for the universe, you have to go through basic training. If you use a military analogy, before you go out to battle, you have to train the soldiers. What are the greatest trials that there can be in terms of keeping and perpetuating the master plan, keeping alive the teachings of the Torah? There are 2 challenges basically that human beings have. One challenge is the challenge of oppression and persecution. If you try to change someone by putting them in a situation where they're going to suffer unless they assimilate, most people will buckle. If that's going to happen to the Jewish people, if they're going to buckle under oppression and they're going to disappear, then it's a failing proposition. The other challenge is assimilation, the temptation to assimilate, because you're living in a bigger culture. Could please unmute?
No, they have to be washed.
Could you please mute? You're unmuted.
Here are the choices. Either they will be washed.
These are my truths.
Those are my travel. Listen to me. You pick another shirt. You got this Sicilian long sleeve flannel shirts. Either pick a different one or give them to me to be washed. That's what I'm telling you now. Well, that's why I'm telling you they were hanging up.
You sure? Could you leave them? Okay. Thank you for muting. Yeah. Okay. So we have two different challenges, the challenge of persecution and the challenge of assimilation, to which Jewish people have been subjected to from the beginning of time. From the time they became a nation, and even before, in Egypt, they were subjected to oppression, slavery, and they were also tempted to assimilate. The Jewish people came out of Egypt with a passing grade. They didn't do very well, but they passed. And God says, now I'm going to give you the Torah. He waited 7 weeks, 49 days of purification, and he gives them the master plan. Now the master plan is to transform the world. How do you transform a world? By following the commandments, doing all the commandments, which involve physical objects, physical energy, and thereby making the world a divine place, because you're using physical things to fulfill God's will. You change the world. And in order to have a model for this, God says, I'm going to give you a special land. I'm going to give you the land of Israel. Israel became the testing grounds. It became the place where there's going to be a transformation of the physical into a spiritual place. And in Israel itself, he gave them Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem itself, he gave them the Temple Mount, and then the temple, the Holy Temple. But in order to build the Holy Temple, there has to be more stability. So what happens? For close to 400 years, the Jewish people in the land of Israel, after Joshua conquers the land of Israel, for 400 years, there is a transitional sort of existence. There was no king, no absolute leader. The 12 tribes had each their own little territory. Sometimes they cooperated with one another. Sometimes they were different. It was like the 13 states before the United States became a country. You had 13 independent states that had some type of relationship with one another, but it was no unified. When King David became king, he unified the country under one king. And now God says, I'm ready to create the temple, the Holy Temple, which would be the model for the whole world, to make the whole world a sanctuary for God. So you have the Jewish people coming to Israel with Joshua in the year 2488 after creation, 40 years after the Exodus, and for the next 400 years or so, the Jews are controlled, each tribe separately, but there was usually one dynamic figure who was known as one of the judges. You had judges like Samson was a judge, but he wasn't a king. He didn't have absolute authority. Then later on you had Samuel, and Samuel was the one who anointed the first king. The first king was actually King Saul, but he didn't work out. He didn't have the ability to control the country. He was not the ultimate king, and therefore was given over to King David. And when King David wanted to build the temple, God says, no, you can't build it because your hands were filled with blood. You were too much involved in warfare, even though the warfare that he engaged in was mandatory. He had to do it for the defense of Israel. But nevertheless, the whole idea of the temple is that God dwells in this world, and that is where God's presence is comfortable in this world. God is only comfortable in a place where there is peace. It says that God, we say this in our prayers, Barchenu Avinu, bless us our Father. But how do we deserve to be blessed? When we are all united, when we're all as one. So until King Solomon came along, God was not ready to take up residence in this world. When the King Solomon assumes power, there was peace in his day. God says, now you can build the temple. The building of the temple is described biblically, and is certainly in the Talmud, as a wedding between God and Israel. And as long as the first temple stood, there was a very good marriage. and the world was becoming a better world. There was a potential for a holier world. However, because God always gives us free choice, to the extent that the first temple manifested a divine presence, there was also a counter force of idol worship. It's a very strange thing, but in a time when people came to the temple and they were imbued with a sense of awareness of God's presence, there was a force of idolatry. And that brought the people down to the point where the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. But even before the temple was destroyed, about a century before, right after King Solomon passed away, the land of Israel split into two kingdoms. There was a two-state solution, you could say, and it didn't work out very well, where you had Solomon's son succeeding him over 2 tribes, and the other 10 tribes seceded from the Union. It happened once before, not just in America, where states secede from the Union. And they had their own king, and they didn't get along. These 2 states didn't get along. And finally, the 10 tribes, which degenerated into idolatry and everything else that was not proper, they were taken over by the Assyrians, not Syrians, and they were driven out. And to this day, we don't know for sure where they are or where their descendants are. Some people have a theory that in Afghanistan there might be some of the 10 lost tribes. Some people feel that they might have even gone so far east to Japan. There are many theories about this, but no definite knowledge of any of the 10 tribes. So when it didn't work out, they just faded away. As long as Jews remained faithful to their teachings, they survived. As soon as they began to abandon their teachings, they disappear. Now, fast forward, you have the Babylonians coming to the land and destroying the temple and driving the Jews into exile. The Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, and you have the story of Purim. What happened in Purim? Haman, the prime minister of Persia, had convinced the king Ahasuerus to annihilate all the Jewish people in one day, that everyone would be commanded to go out and kill his Jewish neighbors in the entire Persian Empire where all the Jews lived. And miraculously, they were spared. What happened then? Why did this happen? Okay, you could say Haman hated Jews, but whenever such a thing happens to the people at large, there's always a higher objective. God is trying to teach us something. And our sages tell us that what happened then is the Jewish people began to assimilate. They began to assimilate. They were invited to this grand party that the king threw for them. And because of their fact that they enjoyed that party, they enjoyed being part of Persian culture, and they were even willing to be participants in an orgiastic party where the king used the vessels of the temple and was gloating over his victory over the Jewish people, that they would never get their temple back. The Jewish people were subjected to this threat of annihilation as a way of awakening them. And that did awaken them, but it took a few more years. Ahasuerus did not let them rebuild the temple, but his successor Darius did allow the temple to be rebuilt. The problem with the second temple was most Jews did not want to go back to Israel. They were happy where they were. Only a few, about 30,000 to 50,000 did return to Israel. Many more came later, and the next 420 years, the second temple existed, so it brought back some of the glory, but it was not comparable to the first temple. During the second temple period, other threats to the Jewish people and their stability materialized. Number one, you had the Hellenists, the Hellenization of Jewish life, where the Greek Empire that took over from the Persian Empire started to make inroads into Israel, and so many of the Jews became assimilated to the point where they took over the control of the land and persecuted their own brethren. Most people who are familiar with the story of Hanukkah know that there was a Greek king, Antiochus, and he was a tyrant and he forbade Jewish life. It was not just the king, it was the Jews themselves the assimilated Jews who were fighting against the loyalists, and that reached a point where they forbade Jewish observance. People who were caught circumcising their children would be put to death. People were being forced into all sorts of orgies and idolatry. That's why Jews shouldn't be so hot about the Olympics. I know I'm gonna make some people upset, because the Olympics was a symbol of Greek culture, where they used to worship their god on this mountain, and they would force Jews to participate in this their orgies and their idolatrous ways. And then we have the story of Hanukkah, where the loyalists, the Maccabees, resisted and prevailed and rededicated the temple. But that was not the only challenge in the Second Temple era. There was another challenge that came a little bit later, the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a group of Jews who denied the belief in the oral tradition. They claimed to only believe in the Torah, the written Torah. But the written Torah without the oral tradition is meaningless. The Torah tells us we have to observe the Sabbath. It doesn't say how to observe the Sabbath. The oral tradition tells us how. They made up their own rules, and they were always in a conflict with the loyalists, who sometimes referred to as the Pharisees. The Pharisees were not Pharisees. The Pharisees were the Jewish loyalists, the ones who remained faithful to Judaism. The Sadducees were not faithful to Judaism, but they controlled the temple for many decades, maybe even more than a century, until finally there was so much conflict in the Jewish community that the temple was ultimately destroyed. The temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, senseless hatred. So the first temple was destroyed because people degenerated into idol worship. It was a breach of their loyalty to God. The second temple was destroyed because of their dissent, the discord that existed, to the point that people had just hatred for the sake of hatred. This is what brought down the second temple. As a result of the destruction of the second temple and the Romans' persecution of the Jews, it was the worst massacre of Jews in all of Jewish history until the Holocaust. The Romans murdered between 1 million and 2 million Jews that lived in the land of Israel, and drove the majority of the Jews out of Israel and scattered the Jews to all four corners of the world. The Romans took Jews to Europe. Jews ended up in North Africa, and from that time onward, you did not have a very strong Jewish presence in the land of Israel. For all of Jewish history, we always had Jews living in Israel. Jews never left Israel, and they never lost hope to come back there. But it was a very limited presence from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple until the modern age, the 19th century, when Jews started going back in large numbers to Israel. So what does that mean spiritually? Spiritually, that means if the Jews had been faithful and loyal to Torah, they would have been able to change the whole world by staying in their home base of Israel. Because the holiness of Israel is so powerful that when you allow it to generate its light, it changes the whole world. It radiates light to the whole world. You don't have to, if you have a heater in one corner of the house, it could heat the whole house if the heater is not compromised. What happened was that the heater, i.e. the temple and the land of Israel, was compromised. So God says, you know what? You're going to have to go to every part of the world to bring the light there directly. It's not going to work. The heater is not going to be enough in a central place to spread its warmth and light to the whole world. You have to come to places directly. You have to move to a place called Buffalo, New York. Who would ever think of Buffalo, New York? Yes, but we had no choice. We have to bring holiness to Buffalo. Jews end up in every, far-flung place in the world. Jews ended up in, Australia. Jews ended up in South America. Wherever you go, there you'll find a Jew here or there. And the reason why Jews are there is in order for them to bring spirituality to that place. How do they do that? By living as a Jew. They don't have to do anything extraordinary. Every mitzvah that a Jew does, wherever he or she is, brings light to that place and forever transforms that place. So what happens? The second temple is destroyed, and now Jewish life continues, but it continues in a different way. You know, the ark in the temple had 2 staves with which they used to carry the ark. But there was very little carrying of the ark. And yet the Torah says you're never allowed to take those staves, those poles, out of the ark. One of the reasons given for that is the ark symbolizes Torah, Jewish knowledge, Torah knowledge. And God wanted that the Jews should know that you can bring the Torah knowledge any place in the world. That even when we don't have the temple, even when we don't live in Israel, we can bring the atmosphere of the temple, the holiest part of which was the ark, with the tablets in it, to every place in the world. Jews have to be prepared to move with their ark, figuratively speaking, to every part of the world. And indeed, when Jews have come to different places in the world, they established centers of Judaism. The first major center was in a little town called Yavna, which was in Israel, right after the destruction of the Second Temple. Actually, right before the destruction of the Second Temple, the leading rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, had a meeting with the Roman general, who later on became the Roman emperor, Vespasian. And he asked him to spare the rabbis in the city of Yavna. Yavna was a small town, and that's where the Sanhedrin, the leading rabbis, had moved from the temple precincts where they had previously been present in the temple. They moved to Yavna. And he says, please don't murder the rabbis, the sages in Yavna. And for Vespasian, that was a small little gesture on his part, because he's going to massacre 2 million Jews. To spare a few dozen Jews was no big deal. He didn't realize that that was the secret of Jewish survival, because those rabbis continued the process of transmitting the Torah, and eventually, even after the most of the rabbis had to leave Israel, it didn't take place overnight, they were able to reestablish themselves in different parts of the world. People, if we go to the current modern age, in the early 20th century, many of the Jews who came from Europe felt that America is different. You're not going to be able to transplant academies of learning, centers of Judaism, the way it was in Poland and in Russia and in Hungary and other places in Europe. America is different. And there was a joke they used to say that people, when they crossed the Atlantic, they would throw their tallis and tefillin overboard into the Atlantic, because we won't need it anymore. We're going to be living in a different land. It's a melting pot. We will assimilate. And then the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, one of the first, he came broken from suffering under the hands of the communists in Russia, then onto the Nazis. And the first thing he did when he came to these shores, and his own followers said, you're crazy if you're doing this. He said, America is not different. America is no different, and I'm going to establish an academy just like we had in Europe. And he wouldn't get off the ship until they told him that an academy for learning Torah was established in New York. So Jews were able to reestablish the miniature temples wherever they lived. And to the extent that those temples were attended and people followed them, Judaism flourished. As soon as people started to assimilate, they disappeared. The next generation was no longer Jewish. Maybe it took 2, 3 generations or 4 generations. Unfortunately, most of the Jews who came to America in the early 20th century or the late 19th century, most of their descendants are no longer identified as Jews. They've totally assimilated. And that was not their intention. They didn't say, when a Jew came over from Europe, he didn't say, I want to assimilate, I don't want to be Jewish anymore, I don't want my children to be Jewish. But that is a reality. That's just a scientific fact. Empirically proven, when a Jew strays from the teachings of Torah, even if it's a minor deviation, but if it's accepted, no one is perfect. We're not saying that everyone has always been perfect, but as soon as you begin to institutionalize some form of assimilation, you know that the third generation will no longer identify as Jewish, and there are some notable exceptions. Take Mendelssohn, Moses Mendelssohn, and we're jumping really ahead. He's in the 18th century. Moses Mendelssohn was an observant Jew, but he tried to create a spirit of assimilation. His own children converted to Christianity, not because they believed in it, but because that gained them acceptance by the Gentiles in Germany. They were part of society, and his descendants, some of which it's said that some of his Mendelssohn descendants were Nazis. Because once you start to change and water down Judaism and institutionalize it and justify it, you know that it's going to go downhill from there. So what happens? The Jewish people in Israel establish academies even after the destruction of the temple, and the Jews in Babylonia did the same thing. And then we have the period known as the Tanaim. Tanaim are the teachers whose opinions were recorded later on in the Talmud. See, for centuries, the Talmud was supposed to be an oral tradition, but because of the dispersion of Jews to the far corners of the earth, it's hard to maintain an oral tradition. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, who was very close to the Roman emperor at that time, that was one of the few periods in history where Jews, the Jewish leadership and Roman leadership were seeing eye to eye. He had the ability to gather all of the sages, and together they created the very first major work, written work of Jewish law called the Mishnah. And his disciples, many of them stayed in Israel to continue the tradition, but most of them moved away to Babylonia. With that became the major center of Jewish scholarship. While Israel's center of scholarship was waning, Babylonia was picking up. And people don't know this, but if you ask the average Jew, which country in the world housed Jewish life, a vibrant Jewish life, the longest of any country? Continuous presence of major Jewish communities in one country for the longest period of time. Which country is that? Iraq, you're right. Now, who would have thought Iraq, of all countries in the world, up until 1948, Iraq boasted a very substantial Jewish community. Two of the chief rabbis of Israel, Rabbi Avadia Yosef and Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, were from Iraq. Iraq had boasted some of the greatest Talmudic scholars, and it has a vibrant Jewish community until the establishment of the State of Israel, which created problems for the Jews in Iraq. But Babylonia was not just a center, it was the center of Jewish scholarship for hundreds of years. So we're talking now about the period known as the writing of the Talmud. The Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah, which elaborates on the Mishnah. The Mishnah just contains the laws. The Talmud elaborates, the Talmud elucidates, and the Talmud became the most important Jewish work, even more important in terms of the time dedicated to its study than the Bible itself. Because the Bible itself, which we call the Tanakh, is a closed book. You can read it and not know what it's talking about, whether it's the narratives and especially the laws of as I gave you the example of keeping the Sabbath. It says in the Torah that you're supposed to rest on the Sabbath. Don't do work on the Sabbath. It doesn't say what work is. And if you ask 10 people, you get 10 different opinions. The oral tradition explained what work is. The same thing with so many of the other parts of the Torah. Without the oral Torah, the written Torah is a closed book. So if I had to choice, if I was Robinson Crusoe, Reuven Krasovsky, and I was exiled to a deserted island, and I can only take one book with me, and the choice is either take a Chumash, 5 books of Moses, or a volume of the Talmud, it would be a dilemma for me. I wouldn't know what to do. I'd try to sneak both of them in, of course, but if I could only take one, it would not be such an easy decision to make, because you cannot really gain anything from the written Torah. I can't say you can't gain anything. You can gain the bulk of it, the substantive part of it, without the oral tradition, which is contained in the Talmud. So now the Talmud was completed. We're talking about the 6th century. The Talmud is now completed, and the rabbis in Babylonia were getting people to asking questions. People were having a hard time studying Talmud. The Talmud is not an easy book to read and to study. And they were getting questions. And together they collected what is called responsa. That became a new genre of Jewish literature, responsa literature. What does responsa mean? Like the word response. people would ask questions of the rabbis, and the rabbis would write their responses based on their understanding of the Talmud. And these rabbis, who were called Geonim, were the leading rabbis in Babylonia, and that was still the center of Jewry. Even though Jews are now spreading out to Europe and North Africa, Babylonia, or Iraq today, was the major center, and those rabbis were the ones who established Jewish norms for the whole world, because they were the greatest experts on the Talmud, living close to the period of the Talmud. But then something happened about 1,000 years ago. The Babylonian or Iraqi presence of scholarship began to dissipate. Jews and Jewish scholars were moving to different parts of the world, and there's a whole story behind that. Some say it was a story of rabbis who were pirated and they were sold and ransomed by different Jewish communities. But whatever the historical reason for that is, what happened was that the rabbis in Babylonia were now moving out to Spain, to France, Italy, and North Africa, primarily. Those were the center. They became the centers of Jewish scholarship. So about 1,000 years ago, you had the towering Ashkenazic scholar. Ashkenaz simply means Germany. So the Jews who went westward to Germany, northwest, they became the Ashkenazic Jews, and the Jews who gravitated towards Spain and Morocco and other parts of North Africa, they became the Sephardic Jews, because Sephard is just the Hebrew word for Spain. So there's German Jews and Spanish Jews, and most Jews either identify with one or the other, although the Middle Eastern Jews are really a third community. They are known as the Eastern communities: Yemenite Jews, Iraqi Jews, Iranian Jews. That's a third grouping, but although sometimes they're lumped together with Sephardic Jews. So what happened, you had the leading scholar in Germany was a man by the name of Rabbi Gershom. He was called the Light of the Exile. He was the most prominent Ashkenazic Jew. He's famous for a few things, but one of the things he's famous for is the law against polygamy. Until that time, polygamy was allowed in Judaism, although it was shunned and it was hardly practiced, but it was still not banned. It was not forbidden to engage in polygamy, having more than one wife. Rabbeinu Gershom banned polygamy. Sephardic Jews did not universally accept that because they were a different community, and they still did practice polygamy to this day, although it's very rare because Israel does not allow it. But if anyone who came from a Sephardic country with more than one wife, they allow them to stay married to those two or multiple wives. So that was Rabbeinu Gershom. He lived about 1,000 years ago. And then on the Sephardic side, you have another rabbi whose name is Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. Rabbi Yitzchak, in the city of Fez in Morocco, known by abbreviation of his name as the Rif. Nothing to do with Raf, just Rif. The Rif was famous because what he did is something that was very necessary. The Talmud became such a cumbersome work, so complicated, so intricate, that people even rabbis who wanted to know how to rule in matters of Jewish law did not have the ability because they couldn't plumb the depths of the sea of the Talmud, as it's often called. It was too difficult for them. So what he did is he abridged the Talmud and selected only the final verdict, so that, and he added some comments of his own also, so that became a major code of Jewish law. That was the Rif. And he was followed 2 generations later on the Ashkenazic side by Rashi. Rashi then became the most prominent commentator of the Bible and of the Talmud. Rashi was a French rabbi, so he was on the Ashkenazic side. His teacher's teacher was Rabbeinu Gershom. On the Sephardic side, the next great luminary was Maimonides. Maimonides, who was born in the 12th century, 1135, became the greatest Sephardic authority who wrote an original code of law systemizing all of Jewish law, even more so than the Rif before him. And that period ended about 500 years ago with the writing of a code of Jewish law known as the Torah. And there's a lot more to say about this, but there's not enough time to go through 5,000 years of Jewish history. The Torah was followed a century or so later by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the most authoritative code of Jewish law called the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law called the Set Table. Jewish scholarship flourished in both Ashkenazic and Sephardic countries for centuries until the 20th century. We don't have time to go into depth into 20th century, but actually before the 20th century, going back 400 years ago to the 16th century, there was a twin phenomenon. You had Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Code of Jewish Law. The Code of Jewish Law was the most systematic presentation of Jewish law, but at the same time you had the greatest teacher of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, known as the Ari. And that started a spiritual revolution, because as we get closer to the end time, to the Messianic age, some of the secrets of Judaism, of Torah, were now becoming exposed. And that led to the Hasidic movement 200 years later with the Baal Shem Tov and other Hasidic luminaries whose teachings are not just about the practical parts of Judaism, but mostly about the spiritual aspects of Judaism. They were always there. They were always known by a select few, but the Hasidic movement started to popularize Jewish mysticism in a way that is accessible to everyone. And the reason, the rationale given, is because we're coming close to the end time. End time, what does the end time mean? The end time does not mean the world is going to be destroyed. We don't believe in the destruction of the world. What we believe in is that God's plan that he set forth at the very first day of creation will finally come to fruition in the end time, which we're very close to, imminent, we believe. And that, in order to be prepared for that, when there'll be an explosion of spirituality, partly because, or mainly because of all the mitzvahs that we have ever done throughout history, have generated so much light that we will become privy to that light. So to appreciate that light, the teachings of mysticism have become widespread and popularized to get us to psych us to that realization that there's more to life than the physical, that there's a spiritual reality. And that will become the Messianic age. So if we have to go through all of Jewish history, we'd say God created the world with a plan. The plan required the right person to start the ball rolling, to form a nation. The nation was given the Torah. The Jewish people were given the Torah. And likewise, all of humanity were given their responsibility, their mission, to observe the 7 Noahide commandments, which are basically the commandments that teach you how to live in a civilized world. And in the cumulative effect of all the mitzvahs that we do, the model of which was the land of Israel, this will bring about the final redemption. If anyone has any questions, let me catch my breath. It's hard to, maybe it was a mistake to try to teach 5,000 years of history in 40 minutes. But
well, as we get near the end, as the Messiah is going to come, do you think that all the other people are going to gravitate to us or become one?
We don't have to become one. We have to become the best of what we are. Every people, every person has their potential, and their potential will be fully realized. There will be total peace between Jews and the other nations. There will be no more war, no more hatred, and they will be fulfilling their mission, just like we will be fulfilling our mission, and we won't be fighting with each other. There won't be any need for that, because we will all recognize, the whole world will recognize the one God. To the extent that people believe in one God and follow the 7 Noahide commandments, they will be part of the experience, of the Messianic experience. Yes?
I have a question about free will. And Me'od Tov, when God created man, he said that was very good. That very being a little extra, is that where free will is implied? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Because animals, you said animals have no choice.
Have no free will, yes.
And angels also have no
Free
choice.
will, yes.
Yeah. But when, in the days of creation, when God created man, he said that it was Me'od Tov, correct? That
Okay,
was
Tov
very
Mi'od, right. Why is man, humanity, Tov Mi'od? Because it's the purpose of creation. If God would only have created animals or angels, which are spiritual animals, there would be no purpose in having the world exist, because they're programmed. They behave the way they're programmed to behave. So what God is doing it without them.
I heard a rabbi once explain that very good is actually extra. That means that there's the inclination for evil.
It says in the Medrash that Tov is the Yetzer Tov. Tov Mi'od is the Malach HaMavis, the angel of death. Is very good, which means that when you transform evil, you accomplish a lot more than just doing good without any challenges of the evil. That's one of the meanings of it. Yes?
You're talking about the Mishnah.
Yeah.
With clarification of bringing the oral into
writing, right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the Talmud expands on that. And then that was confusing, so then it seems to condense again.
Okay, that's a very good point. It seems that Jewish scholarship starts off with a very limited structure, then it starts to expand, but then the expansion becomes very cumbersome and very difficult to navigate, so then someone comes along and condenses it into a smaller, more manageable text. And then there are commentary, like the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, written about 450 years ago. You know, it was supposed to be a guide, and people just follow it. But then there are commentaries on it. Commentaries that explain it, that argue with it, that present new situations. So then now the Code of Jewish Law has hundreds, if not thousands, of volumes of commentary on it. So later on, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, condensed the Shulchan Aruch into a manageable text. And then there are commentaries on that. And then right now, I can't give you the exact number, but I'd say there are about 1,000 volumes, at least, of contemporary rabbis who have taken different subjects and given you a condensed version of it. And even as people still expand, so Jewish law, Jewish knowledge expands and contracts. It doesn't change, it just develops.
Different amplifications and emphasis put on a point so that...
Yes, that's true.
You really can't get the true picture.
If you want to get the practical knowledge, you have to go to the condensed versions. If you want to get the theoretical basis behind it, you want to know all the arguments, you study the commentaries that are more expansive.
Well, but the Mishnah started out with commentaries anyway. I mean,
The Mishnah was not, no, the Mishnah was just stating the laws.
But there were the pros and the cons. There was the view that was accepted and the contrary.
The Mishnah will record differences of opinion, but it also tells you, or at least hints to which opinion one should follow.
Right.
But it doesn't explain.
More than hint.
It does no. Sometimes it doesn't tell you which opinion to follow. But you understand that when the Mishnah records one opinion, Rabbi Meir says, then it says the sages say, you know that you follow the sages. They're the majority. The Torah says you follow the majority whenever there's a dispute.
Right. That's
That's the hint. That majority versus minority. But sometimes it's minority versus minority, and it's not always clear which minority opinion is the one that's followed.